So we'll finish up Neoclassical France by talking about some of the different ways in which our Cardinal Mazarini and lots of other people were able to bring major Italian influences to what's going on in France at the time. So one of those big influences is the adoption of and rigid enforcement of what's known as the Neoclassical Ideal. And so this is something that was developed sort of from Aristotle's Poetics. Basically what happened is, as you recall from Aesthetics and from earlier this semester, Aristotle wrote the Poetics, right? And we know those. The Poetics are not rules for theater. The Poetics are, hey, I'm reading some scripts that won some awards and I would like to note some positive things about them. Later on, in Rome, a guy named Horace comes along, reads the Poetics, and kind of writes his own version of it called Ars Poetica. And really just sort of takes what Aristotle was doing. The Romans did a lot of this, right? Takes what Aristotle was doing, rewrites it, makes it a little more strict, right? Less assessment, a little more rules, but not quite. Then in Neoclassical Italy and spreading throughout Europe in a couple different places, those Horace's ideas of Ars Poetica are taken and made into hard and fast rules. So now here we are in this era saying, look, if you're going to write a play, you must do these things. And so this is sort of a manual for how to write plays and areas which you should not stray out of. And I brought up my image of the French Academy here because the French Academy is the primary arbiter of the Neoclassical Ideal. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. Neoclassical Ideal gives us rules for playwriting. One of the things it says is you get 2 genres and only 2 genres. Your play better be a comedy, in which we are talking about family or domestic subjects, lower classes, and happy endings. Or it can be a tragedy, with ruling classes, obviously sad endings, and lofty heightened language and subject matter. That's all you get. None of this in-between weird stuff. Comedy or tragedy. The Neoclassical Ideal calls for verisimilitude. This is a complex term to kind of understand, but I think generally we can break it down to 3 sort of areas. First off, verisimilitude calls for there to be reality on stage. And I do not mean, I've got it in quotes there because the Neoclassical Ideal doesn't mean actual, normal, everyday reality. What it means is ideality. That is, verisimilitude says Neoclassical Ideal plays should put on stage the ideal world. Not the world as it actually is, which is sort of gritty and dumb and boring and flawed and sinful and all these other things. But we should put ideality on stage. What we see on stage should be more epic, more tragic, more comic, more beautiful, etc. than real life. But these are high-minded people, I guess, so they called it reality, which is sort of ridiculous, but there you have it. They also said that we must have morality on stage. That is, characters on stage must act with a moral purpose, and if they don't, they should be punished by the play. Finally, we should have universality on stage. And what I mean by universality is easily recognizable, simple, straightforward character types. I need a tragic hero, check, right, with all those qualities of the tragic hero. If it's a comedy, right, my sort of stock comic characters need to be drawn from stock types, etc. What verisimilitude's universality does not allow for is quirky, unusual, complex characters that don't quite fit a pre-existing idea or mold. Hamlet, I'm looking at you, as one of many examples. And then, most restrictive of all, the Neoclassical Ideal calls for the absurd enforcement of the unities. First, the unity of time means that the time that passes on stage must be the same as the time that passes in real life. If an hour and a half goes by on stage, then your play should be an hour and a half long. None of this cutting of scenes and jumping through time and moving forward, right? Later on, the unities, the Neoclassical Ideal got a little bit liberal and the unities were stretched to say your play could cover any 24-hour period. But like the absurdly specific 24 hours. Like you get 1 day to tell your story. Your play can last half an hour, great, or an hour and a half, great. But the things that happen in that play can't take place any longer than in 24 hours. Place, you get 1 location. And I mean like 1 actual physical location. Later on, when they loosened up on the unity of time, they also loosened up on the unity of place and said, all right, okay, if you can get somewhere within those 24 hours, conceivably, then all right, we'll allow you to use that as a location. This led to, you can imagine, right? Math. Imagine doing math about a location of a play. So right here I am, I'm going to get on a horse and ride across town. Now you as a player, I'd have to figure out how long that would actually take. There is an attempt to eliminate the suspension of disbelief with the unities. Kind of. And action. We need a single plot. None of this multi-layered, interweaving, complex plot business. We need one single story and that's it. So my question for you is, why would the French have loved the neoclassical ideal? Because they loved it, and I'll show you in a minute how much they loved it. What does it do for the theater? How does it impact the theater positively, and how does it impact it negatively? And just as I've been hinting at, a sort of hypothetical, what if they'd had all these rules in Shakespeare's England? Take a look at Shakespeare's body of work. Hell, take a look at Spain's body of work anywhere and apply the neoclassical ideal to it and tell me what you have left. So that's one of the big Italian influences, Neoclassical France. We also can talk about that Italian influence in execution. In 1638, Pierre Corneille writes a play called Le Cid, which is basically this really problematic play in terms of the neoclassical ideal. It expands beyond 24 hours and it has a bunch of locations. And so as he's rewriting it, he crams it all into 24 hours. But it gets to the point where like a guy goes to war in a different country and then comes back for more within those 24 hours. And there are a bunch of other issues with it. Basically, the French Academy puts out a judgment against Le Cid and said, this is not acceptable. You have broken the neoclassical ideal. We are Neoclassical France. You can't do that here. And the play is effectively censored and banned. So Corneille's got to rewrite it, and we've got a handful of challenges. But I use this as an example of how obsessed they were about doing what the Italians did and how obsessed they were with control and organization and structure, keeping things very, very tight and under wraps and always related to what had come before, Greece and Rome. Then we also, because we're influenced by Italy, we've got some commedia influences as well. And you can see all throughout numerous French comedies the influence of commedia stock types. And so one of the things I want you to do is, first off, assess Tartuffe as a work of the neoclassical ideal. Does it fit all the criteria? And then also I'm going to ask you, where do we see commedia characters? Go back and look at your commedia lecture at the different stock types that I gave you. Some of those stock types unequivocally show up here in this play, and I want you to be able to identify those as well. And we'll close with two fantastic epic images from French theater. This is an Italian set designer designing a partial three-dimensional flat painted backdrop. But what you're also seeing here, see the people up at the top? Those people would have been flown in on a giant machine. And basically, right, enormous excessive visual scenery, highly influenced by what's going on in Italy, perspective painting, and also influenced by that very indulgent Italian theater saying, hey, look, my theater is giant and epic and amazing, and we can fly people in and move people in and out and all kinds of stuff. Here's another great example of this. And this is a 1645, what's called a machine play, as the previous one was also a machine play. And that is not a lot of content here, but just an opportunity to bring in enormous scenic effects. So the clouds you see up here with gods floating around them, those would have been actual things that were lowered in from the fly space or carried on somehow to create this sort of epic over the top kind of thing. I just like to close with these because they really show how over the top and indulgent the visual scenery was, just like it was in Italy here. It's also a good reminder, mostly what you're seeing here are flat painted backdrops, but some of the cool, expensive, over-the-top scenery is machines that would have been flown in. So that concludes our lecture on Renaissance France. Thank you.